When most of us think of nonprofits, we often think about Bill Gates eradicating polio, feeding the hungry, and housing the poor. However, in this video, we're going to unpack why most nonprofits are misguided at best and terrorist organizations at worst. Let's look at a few case studies. Wikipedia needs no introduction. It's one of the largest repositories for knowledge and information online in the world, and I'm by no means planning to diminish this fact. Wikipedia is very reliable when it comes to gathering truly objective information, but there are a couple reasons as to why it's not as unbiased as we think it is. You've probably heard that you shouldn't trust Wikipedia as your only source of information, and that is true, but I would like to expand.
The idea is that when venturing beyond the realm of simple, uncontroversial facts, the article should mostly try to avoid forming its own conclusions. Rather, it should try to present the arguments and counterarguments of both sides and allow the reader to make their own assessment. In practice, however, it rarely actually works out that way, because Wikipedia is a product of both its rules and the opinions and agendas of its editors, moderators, and administrators. Its rules dictate that articles must be based on reliable sources, and these reliable sources must be published by a reputable party. That alone already injects a ton of bias into the encyclopedia, as what's considered reliable and reputable in the first place is not only subjective, but can be very prone to manipulation. When the community comes together to decide on whether a source is reliable or not, the simple fact that other so-called reliable sources consider it reliable themselves is given huge weight, such as in this discussion about the reliability of an Australian military think tank, which was nearly voted as being reliable just on the basis that other Western media outlets like to cite it. So it's a self-perpetuating circle of bias.
Harvard University is one of the best examples of a university labeled as a nonprofit, even when it is. Harvard is by far not the worst perpetrator out of these universities, but for this video's sake, we will use this school as an example. Harvard receives huge amounts of philanthropic and government donations and subsidies, partially for research, but also for a variety of things such as improvement of campus quality, DEI, etc. However, according to a 2019 National Bureau of Economic Research working paper by Peter Arcidiacono, 43% of students admitted to Harvard College were either athletes, legacies, members of the dean's or director's list of relations of donors or prominent figures, or children of university employees. Additionally, 70% of Harvard legacy applicants were white, and 67% of Harvard University undergraduates come from the top 20% of the income distribution, in comparison to only 4.5% coming from the bottom 20% of the income distribution. Ironically, Harvard proves that many of these DEI programs are just a form of corporate performative wokeness, pretending to care about the economically oppressed while actually being the economic oppressor. Not to mention that the Harvard CEO was paid $10 million last year. Now let's look at HomeRise, a medium-sized nonprofit in San Francisco. Again, this is not the biggest nor worst nonprofit dealing with housing. I'm just using a somewhat random example for the sake of the video.
There's an organization here called HomeRise. They're one of the largest, I think the second largest provider of housing for the homeless in San Francisco. They have contracts that total about close to $100 million with the city over the course of like a 5-year span to provide housing for the homeless. They were subject to a third-party audit, and in that audit, they found that there was what they called financial malfeasance and gross misreporting of funding, and also gross misuse of funding that was restricted specifically to house the homeless, that was being used to hold events that cost $12,000, limos, dinners, giving bonuses to people. Creating new director positions within the organization, and then using the money that was supposed to be allocated to actually house people to pay people salaries instead. And over 118 credit cards.
Far too many of these nonprofits go under the radar, taking advantage of government subsidies and donations. Additionally, these nonprofits could solve the homelessness crisis in San Francisco right now if they wanted to. There's about 8,000 people homeless in San Francisco and about 61,000 vacant housing units. Now, I'm no mathematician, but I think there's enough houses for everyone. There's no quote-unquote housing crisis, there's only a distribution crisis. Even in the US, according to a study by the United Way, there's approximately 16 million vacant homes compared to 500,000 to 750,000 people experiencing homelessness, reports indicate. This means there are roughly 28 vacant homes for every one person experiencing homelessness. To many, Bill Gates is the quintessential benevolent billionaire, recently announcing that he would donate nearly all his money and close the Gates Foundation by 2045. First off, where's he donating this money? The answer is that Bill Gates is donating all his money to himself, his own foundation. And on the surface, there isn't really anything wrong with that, especially since he plans on closing the foundation down in 20 years. But let's remember, it was only a few decades ago that Bill Gates was one of the most hated people in the world.
Microsoft will have to pay over $700 million in fines after the European Commission found that it failed to comply with an earlier antitrust
I
settlement.
reluctantly accept your proposal.
Well, everyone always does. Buy 'em out, boys!
The Justice Department has charged Microsoft with engaging in anti-competitive and exclusionary practices designed to maintain its monopoly in personal computer operating systems.
You guys never understood. You never understood the first thing about this.
Hey, what the hell's going on?
Oh, I didn't get rich by writing a lot of checks.
What non-Microsoft browsers were you concerned about in January of 1996?
I don't know what you mean concerned.
What is it about the word concerned that you don't understand?
It was pretty obvious that the only reason Bill Gates even began his philanthropy was because he wanted to buy public approval, and that his own facade as a good person was beginning to fade.
But while the public just learned about the divorce last week, it had apparently been in the works since 2019 and through the pandemic.
But new reporting from the New York Times outlines numerous meetings between Gates and Epstein and a conversation with Bill and Melinda Gates' foundation, a connection between their foundation and JP Morgan to set up a charitable fund that would financially benefit Epstein.
Tonight, we're learning Bill and Melinda Gates' divorce has been in the works for about 2 years. The Wall Street Journal is reporting Melinda Gates had been consulting with lawyers since 2019.
Realistically, I doubt that Bill Gates will truly actually donate all that money, because losing that money would mean losing political power for him and his kids. But even if he did, it creates a moral question. Even if billionaires donated all their money, what's saying that the billionaire knows what's best for others? How would a rich person know what's best for poor people? Why does Bill Gates get to decide the outcome of the lives of millions? Many researchers have noted that the Gates Foundation is too focused on drugs, vaccines, and other technological solutions for global health problems. But many researchers, by contrast, would prefer a focus on the less exciting but crucial work of strengthening the health systems of poor countries. The problem here is that the Gates Foundation is only helping these countries in the short term, but essentially forces them to be reliant on wealthy philanthropy, who not only have no interest in helping to improve infrastructure in the country, but actually have a vested interest in doing the exact opposite. The most notable example of this is when Gates vocally opposed lifting COVID-19 vaccine patents for poorer countries. He pressured the Biden administration to do this because he was heavily invested in IP in the medical field. The only implication of this is that only the countries that can afford the patent are allowed to produce their own vaccines, and those that can't pay for it just have to hope that wealthier nations gift it to them, thus forcing them to be reliant on Western forces. In conclusion, yes, nonprofits are a problem, but they are not the problem. Nonprofits are a symptom of something deeper. In essence, nonprofits are privatized social programs, which oftentimes takes advantage of their status in the form of propaganda, overly inflated salaries, wasteful spending, and tax cuts. But I think it's still important to note that a lot of nonprofits really aren't that bad. Yes, you should be looking into nonprofits with a critical lens, but you should also be volunteering at your local food bank or homeless shelter when you can. So why do so many predatory nonprofits exist? When you reach a point of wealth where you can buy anything, the only thing left to buy is power. That's why you see more billionaires in politics, and that's why you see so many of them in philanthropy. You can't expect those at the top to actually help those at the bottom when their mouths are already fed.
Many of these NGOs are semi-sophisticated money laundering operations for billionaires who embed their wealth in nonprofits to avoid paying taxes. Elon Musk himself owns a $5 billion charity called the Musk Foundation with no employees or staff. And notable other billionaires and Trump allies like Jeff Bezos owns a $100 million nonprofit with the stated goal of combating homelessness, or rather funding funding partner organizations who take that money and then go fight homelessness. In the city of Seattle, of all places, where nothing has significantly changed. But that doesn't seem to really concern wealthy NGO and nonprofit investors like Musk and Bezos. After all, it's not just for PR and tax purposes. As scholar Ruth Wilson Gilmore puts it, the nonprofit industrial complex is also dependent on surveillance and control. The rich have a vested interest in maintaining the status quo, particularly when it comes to wealth distribution and control of media and information streams. So control of any nonprofits in the social justice or so-called revolutionary realm allows them to do a few things. But most importantly, it allows them to create a quasi-welfare style financial dependency amongst the leaders of these causes and threaten to pull funding if they don't fall in line with the imposed narrative and agenda of government agencies and private corporations.
There's no true incentive to actually help those in need. Thus, there must be manufactured incentives for helping those in need, a culture that praises those who help others, tax breaks to nonprofits, government subsidies to nonprofits, whatever. I think it's pretty well established that many nonprofits are misguided at the bare minimum, but many of you might remember that I call nonprofits terrorist organizations at worst. Let me clarify why this is the case. Terrorism is a very politically charged word, so I'm going to try to use it as something with a more neutral connotation. According to the CIA, terrorism is the, quote, calculated use of violence or the threat of violence to attain political goals. Terrorism doesn't mean bad or good. There's terrorists that most people like, such as Malcolm X and Nelson Mandela, but also terrorists that most people dislike, such as Hitler and Stalin. Note that none of these people actually killed anyone or personally committed acts of violence, but they're still labeled terrorists. And this is the same with nonprofits. Obviously, there's nonprofits that just straight up advocate for and fund violence and political change, like the ones involved in January 6th, but many indirectly create violence, like Bill Gates, as aforementioned, vocally opposing lifting COVID-19 vaccine patents for poor countries and pressuring the Biden administration to do this. This is a perfect example of terrorism because he's literally calling for increased oppression on already exploited countries and the indirect death of hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people. And the only reason his opinion is significant is because of the money he's donated to these countries in the first place. His rhetoric actually did have impact, as Biden did temporarily block poor countries from access to COVID-19 vaccine patents, even if only temporarily. So yes, Bill Gates is technically a terrorist as categorized by the CIA. So, how can we solve this problem? The answer is that you can't. Maybe you can increase regulations, create bureaus to investigate each and every nonprofit, even end the privatization of nonprofits, but this will only work for so long. Eventually, money from elites will seep into the government and nonprofits will revert back into a system catered for those same elites.
If they earned it, then I think that that's good, and I think that they deserve it, but even if you earned it, you still owe. Because look at me, I don't have that mega money, but I feel guilty walking by somebody. I got to give them some mail. And if I know I got $3,000 in my pocket, I feel like it's wrong to give that person a quarter or $1. It's wrong. Only you know what you got in your pocket. And that's wrong. No matter what they do, if they take it and drink it, they take it and drink it. But, I mean, you got. You understand? And we all know how hard it is, and it's not about if you good or you bad. So since it's not about if you good or you bad, we know that because he don't got don't mean he was bad. Or don't mean he's a criminal, or don't mean he's crazy, or a drug addict, or none of that. It just means he don't got. And ain't it bad that you got 30? I mean, can you imagine somebody having $32 million? $32 million. And this person has nothing, and you can sleep. You can still go to the movies about, and then these are the type of people that get humanitarian awards. Millionaires. How can they be humanitarians? By the fact that they millionaires and there's so many poor people shows how unhumane they are.